Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our studies of First Kings. Today we're in First Kings chapter 8, and this is a lengthy chapter, and there is a lot of content that we could spend time talking about. Its 66 verses are the longest in the book of First Kings. And yet, there's several things that just kind of jumped off the page at me as I was going through and reading this particular chapter. And so those are the things that I'd like us to talk about this morning, and maybe there'll be things that you'll find interesting. The first one is found in verse 9, and it's almost a side note as you get into the first section of this chapter. But in the discussion of the Ark of the Covenant being brought and placed into the temple and the things that surround that, you read in verse 9 about the contents of the ark. In verse 9 it says, "Nothing was in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt." So the only thing in the Ark of the Covenant at this time are the 2 tablets of stone. Now what makes that interesting is that originally there were 3 items that were in the Ark of the Covenant. You had the 2 tablets of stone, and then you had a pot of manna, which was their food while they were traveling on that journey. And then you have Aaron's rod that budded. Those were the 3 items that were originally in the Ark of the Covenant. But by the time we reach the days of Solomon, it is only the 2 tablets of stone that are still in the Ark of the Covenant. We do not know when the other 2 items were removed or what happened to them or anything of that nature. We simply know that by the time Solomon comes along, the only item that is left is the tablets of stone that Moses received on Mount Sinai. And so it's kind of an interesting little side note that Solomon does tell us what it is, or we are told in the days of Solomon, what it is that was actually in the Ark of the Covenant when it was brought into Solomon's temple. The main course of the chapter deals with Solomon's prayer, and that is going to begin in verse 22. But within the confines of this prayer, there are a lot of different elements, and there are a lot of elements for us to think about and for us to consider. You have situations such as Solomon talking to God in this prayer about asking God to be mindful of people who come to him from all different ways and from all different vantage points, from whether or not they are in exile or whether or not they're in captivity, whether or not they have been ones who have been faithful up until this time, or whether they are repenting and turning back from having done wrong. One of the things that was interesting that he talks about here in this section is the fact that he has this statement in there that all men sin and that all men have sinned, that there is nobody who is perfect in their standing before God. And much of the prayer is dealing with the fact of how God interacts with and deals with his people. Because remember, the temple is built not as a monument to the power of God necessarily, but as a place for men to worship God, a place for men to bring their offerings before God. It was meant as a house of worship. And that's what it was designed to be. You know, many times when you have the temples that are created by men's hands to serve their various gods and things of that nature, they are meant more to be monuments to power. And yet this is not what Solomon's temple was designed to be. It was intended to be a permanent place after the order of the tabernacle for the people of God to be able to come together and bring their offerings and worship him according to the means that he has commanded. And so Solomon here is going to talk about God being willing to listen, being willing to hear, being willing to accept repentance, being willing to forgive, being willing to do all of those things. And certainly in our mindset, as we come to God and as we look at God today, all of those things are very important, not just for us to understand, but for us to realize that they've always been a facet of how God has dealt with mankind and what God desires to do for mankind. That all of those things are represented in our relationship with God, even today. And so Solomon is going to go through this very lengthy prayer to God. And it is a beautiful set of statements that he is going to make in this regard. And so it's important for us to take the time to examine Solomon's prayer here in this occasion. And I would encourage you, if you haven't taken some time to just break down the elements that are found there, it's worth your time to do that. The last thing I want us to consider in regard to this chapter today is found toward the end of the chapter in verse 61. Because there Solomon is going to be talking about in his blessing toward the people. After he has the prayer toward God, then he is going to turn, as it were, and he is going to stand up off of his knees, and he is going to address the people, and he's going to bless them. But I want you to notice what he says in verse 61. He says, "Let your heart therefore be loyal to the Lord our God, to walk in his statutes and keep his commandments as at this day." He talks about in a couple verses earlier how that, he has made supplication before the Lord for the Lord to be near them night and day, for God to be with them in everything that they do, for God to listen to them, for him to accept and forgive them when they fall short. But he said in order for that to be the case, our hearts have to be what they're supposed to be. And it's a two-way street. It's not just one side or the other. It has to be the case that our hearts have to be geared toward God if we want God to listen to us. And so he says, verse 61, "Let your heart be loyal to the Lord." We talk about a lot of things in our relationship with God. How often do we talk about loyalty? How often do we talk about the importance of our hearts being loyal? We talk about God will not forsake us, that God will not leave us, that God will always be there for us, and he will. But only if our hearts remain loyal to him. So these are some of the things that I've noticed in 1 Kings chapter 8. There are a lot more pieces of detail and depth of discussion that we could have on this particular chapter. But I hope that these things have been beneficial to you and have maybe helped curry some thoughts that can then help you as you analyze chapter 8. Next time we will come back and we will begin looking at 1 Kings chapter 9. And I hope that you will join us then as we do. But until then, have a great day.